So, who was our manliest president? Historians agree it was this guy. I would add he also had the coolest smile in my book. Theodore Teddy Roosevelt was a manly man. He knew when to give out the tough talk, and he knew when to climb onto his horse and lead a charge up San Juan Hill during the Spanish American War. Oh, and he also boxed. He actually lost some of the vision in one eye while working with a sparring partner. And not that this was a tough guy thing, but the teddy bear was named after none other than Teddy Roosevelt, because that's pretty much how Americans saw him. A bear of a man who was still sort of cuddly. But when TR was a kid, he wasn't so tough. He was actually afraid of church. The historian David McCullough writes about it in his book Mornings on Horseback, which tells the story of Teddy's early years. He tells us that Mittie Roosevelt, his mother, by the way, footnote here, Mittie was born a Bullock, and she spent much of her childhood in Bullock Hall in Roswell, just down the road. She grew up as a Southern belle and is thought to be one of the inspirations for Scarlett O'Hara. Oh, and she was the grandmother of Eleanor Roosevelt. End of footnote. Okay, what was I talking about?
Teddy Roosevelt's childhood.
Okay, thanks. Teddy actually grew up in New York City, and his family attended the Madison Square Presbyterian Church. But Teddy didn't like the church, and he wouldn't set foot inside it unless a grown-up went with him. He didn't like talking about it, but finally his mom pried it out of him, why he was so scared of their church. He was terrified of something called the zeal that lurked there. With all those dark corners in the sanctuary, he said, it was crouched in wait to spring on him and eat him up. Mittie Roosevelt asked him who in the world told him such a thing. He said, the pastor. The pastor was reading from the Bible all about the zeal. So Mrs. R. actually got her hands on a concordance and read down through all the zeal verses until Teddy stopped her and said, that's the one at John 2:17. She read, his disciples remembered that it was written, the zeal for your house will consume me. I have no idea if that's what inspired the future president to become so manly, but I do wonder about whether anyone today would find church so frightening, particularly the idea of God. People spoke of the fear of God in those days, and a lot of preaching contained a certain amount of fear-mongering. The lake of fire found its way into any number of sermons, and we can agree there are better ways to introduce our children to the concept of God. First and foremost, we taught our kids that God is love, unconditional love, love that our kids could not lose, any more than they could lose mom's or dad's love. But I hope we also taught them about the greatness of God, not in a scary way, but more about the majesty of God, the awesomeness of his person. In some religious circles, God has become something of a good buddy from heaven, somebody who politely agrees with us on everything we wish to think or do, an invisible friend. But the God of the Bible is the eternal, unchanging, all-knowing creator of everything that exists. He is the ground of all being, a God of endless love, but also one who loves justice and righteousness and calls upon me to live in accordance with that. A God before whom my feeble understanding crumbles so that I can't comprehend, but I can worship. The way it works is I don't tell God about my problems. I tell my problems about God, because his greatness, his reality, is the ultimate fact of my life or anyone else's. Isaiah says so here in the 40th chapter. Isaiah tells us that in God we find strength. Isaiah 40 is one of those Hall of Fame chapters of the Bible. If you've hung out in church much, you're likely to recognize multiple verses from this page. Isaiah 40 basically kicks off Isaiah Part 2. All the first 39 chapters amounted to a dire warning about judgment on Israel, Barbarians at the gates, turn back to God now. But at chapter 40, 150 years have passed. No more reason for warnings. The Israelites are in exile, in bondage, and the author's purpose now is to offer comfort, hope, and reassurance. Don't give up, he's saying. Where there's God, there's a future. There's a tomorrow. Now, we're going to study verses 21 onward, but let's take a quick look at the Hall of Fame stuff just before it. Music people love these verses, as you'll see. And so does Jesus. He quotes Isaiah more than any other book. So Isaiah begins, "Comfort, comfort, my people," handles Messiah, which dips deep into Isaiah, sets this to music. And then a voice cries out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." Yep, that's the John the Baptist verse. One of the early church fathers said Isaiah gazed into the future and saw Jesus more clearly than anyone else. You can just about write a biography of Jesus from Isaiah verses alone. Here's another one you might recognize from a choral piece. And then this one was engraved on the outside of my first gift Bible, given to me by my grandfather. "The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever." I had no idea who Isaiah was when I was a kid, but I saw those words whenever I held my Bible on the way to church. Somewhat ironically, over time, the inscription faded, but by that time the words themselves were inscribed on my soul. Funny how that works. We take for granted the beauty of poetry like that in the Bible. Imagine it was written in ancient Hebrew, and it stands up 3,000 years later in modern English, which proves Isaiah right. There's something special about the Word of our God. It's not like other words. It stands forever. The following verses are equally interesting, calling on Israel to recognize the greatness of God, the superiority of God to any others that were worshipped. For example, he compares God to idols made of wood or stone, and how the pagans had to worry about the idols tipping over. Yet our God has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the sky between his thumb and little finger. Strong stuff. And then we come to verse 21. Let's begin reading there. "Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to live in, who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows upon them and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. To whom then will you compare me? Or who is my equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes on high and see, who created these? He who brings out their host and numbers them, calling them all by name, because he is great in strength, mighty in power, not one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Isaiah uses this phrase, have you not known? Have you not heard? It's a rhetorical device that he repeats, and he's basically saying, didn't you get the memo? Have you ever noticed prophets can be a little on the sarcastic side? Here he's saying, try to keep up. And then he gives them the big picture. He who sits upon the circle of the earth. Let's look at what that meant to his readers. Ancient people understood the world this way. God looked down upon this globe. They kind of had the right idea, but everything was in the globe, including the sun, sky, moon, and stars. And the sky stood on foundations, as you can see on each side. The earth was a disk that sat on waters, and beneath the earth was something like hell called Sheol, but it was watery instead of fiery. You entered it only through death. You might recognize the underworld from Greek mythology. So, God's creation was kind of a snow globe that he looked down upon, and the poetry of the prophets reflects that. Isaiah is doing just what we do when we point to the skies and say, imagine God made all of this. The Israelites are feeling tiny, helpless, and Isaiah says, it's not how big you are, but how big your God is. And he's helping them think about how big God is. Earlier, Isaiah said, the grass withers and the flower fades. So now he talks about the world leaders, kings, princes, generals, as so much chaff that God blows away after their 5 minutes on the world stage. They're not the giants the Israelites think they are. God says, are you comparing me to these grasshoppers? Now, it doesn't seem clear in this next passage, but we're talking about the stars here. Lift up your eyes. Who creates these? God calls them by name. In the ancient sky, of course, without all the light pollution of today's cities, you could see thousands of stars. Isaiah's point is, do you really think your way is hidden from a God who numbers the stars, who puts them there and can name every one of them? Isaiah brings this to a boil now with another, have you not known, have you not heard? God never grows weary, he says. He never runs out of steam. His understanding has no limits. Okay, but then look how the direction of Isaiah's teaching changes from God's strength to yours. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. This is what preaching and teaching do. They start with God and bring it down to personal territory. Prayer always begins with God and works down to us in the same way. Only in understanding who God is do we have the perspective to understand who we are. So in this final section, one of my favorite passages in the Bible, he says, even young people wear down. Even the strong have their limits. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Folks, this is why the word of our God doesn't fade. There's timeless power in these words. They give life to hurting people at this very moment, just as they did 3,000 years ago. Now, this is where the preacher or the teacher says, what about you? How weary are you? How much discouragement are you dealing with? What's weighing you down? 4 words, wait upon the Lord. Now, what's involved in that is a whole other lesson, but it's more than just waiting. It's waiting with eagerness, with trust. It's waiting with sensitivity to God's voice and what he might be saying. Wait upon the Lord. At the most basic level, you'll stop waiting upon yourself for a few minutes. You'll fix your mind on eternal things, on the power of God, and your soul will feel new strength. And at some point, you'll fly like an eagle. That's what the Bible says. It all begins with knowing the greatness of God, but it ends in you renewing your strength. Thanks for listening.